Order, order. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Daniel Kawczynski to move the motion.
I'm very grateful, Sir Roger, for being able to highlight my debate on LGBT tolerance and education and acceptance in schools, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Roger. I wanted to call the debate for two main reasons. Firstly, because of the protests that I've seen on television recently at schools in Birmingham. My constituency is in that region, and we have seen over the last few months increasing number of protests outside some of these Birmingham schools, with parents protesting very vociferously against any form of LGBT teaching in those schools. And secondly, Sir Roger, because my researcher in the House of Commons came to see me the other day to highlight a situation where a friend of his had come out to him, crying, very upset, very vulnerable, didn't know how he was going to broach the subject with his family. And for me to see that even today, in 2019, there are young people who are still fearful of broaching their sexuality and who they are falling in love with their most intimate and closest friends and family members, is something that is clearly very worrying. I was born, Sir Roger, in communist Poland, the only Conservative member of Parliament to have been born in a communist country, I believe, and that was... no, I am, I can assure you. I've checked it out already. And communist Poland, I can assure you, Sir Roger, was, in my view, a highly intolerant society towards LGBT people. The Catholic Church in Poland, and I speak as a Roman Catholic, but the Catholic Church in Poland also was at the forefront of teaching young people and society at large that being gay was a sin. It was a sin, but it also should be punished. And that people who had the temerity to fall in love with a same-sex partner will ultimately go to hell. They will be condemned to purgatory and hell because they happen to be gay. And I think that this had a huge impact on a generation of children in communist Poland when it came to evaluating their own self-worth and what they felt of themselves when the church and the state were so homophobic towards this issue. The irony, and I speak again as a Roman Catholic, but the irony of this is that subsequently we have come across so many cases and so many prosecutions of Catholic priests, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in America, or many other countries around the world, where Catholic priests from the pulpit, Sir Roger, have been informing us what a sin homosexuality is, but in their spare time, when Mass is over, going out and sexually abusing young boys on an industrial scale. I don't believe that the Roman Catholic Church has apologized enough, neither in this country or around the world, for the appalling abuses that Roman Catholic priests have carried out over decades against these young, vulnerable and innocent boys, many of whom will inevitably suffer the mental angst and torture as a consequence of those vile acts of abuse against young children. And of course, we have different situations that we face ourselves. I think because I was brought up in such a homophobic society, inevitably, I was conditioned, and I've used that word on the radio Shropshire today when I was interviewed on this issue. I was conditioned as a young person that homosexuality was bad and it was a sin, and that you should feel ashamed of being gay, And so, of course, what do? Some young people have the confidence and the conviction in themselves that they will set that aside. And they will say, no, I'm gay and I'm proud, from a very young age. Other people, Sir Roger, don't have that confidence within them. So they hide what they are and who they are. They will hide under rocks or under stones and not peek out because they are fearful of the consequences for them and their families of showing that they are proud in being gay. And as a young person, I have to say to you, Sir Roger, I actually went as far as to trying to trick my own brain into thinking I was straight. And you do it over and over again. You pray to God that he hopes that he will change you somehow, that you won't have these strange feelings. Could you please be heterosexual? Could you please only be interested in women? And you try to trick the brain. And one thing I have learned in my 47 years, the most important thing I have learned in my 47 years, Sir Roger, is that you can't trick the brain. You can do almost anything, but you can't reprogram your mind. You can't reprogram your brain to be something sexually which you are not. So fearful was I that when it came to the time to come out, Sir Roger, I had to go back to Shrewsbury to inform the Shrewsbury Conservative Association that having been married to a lady for 10 years, I was now in a same-sex relationship. And I was so fearful, given the conditioning that I went through as a child, that I had to go to the House of Commons Health and Wellbeing team. And as you know, Sir Roger, these are great people who work here in the House of Commons who help members of Parliament through periods of stress, but also strain and mental problems. And I had to go and see them and talk to them. And it was only them, Sir Roger, and I want to pay tribute to the staff here at the House of Commons who work in the Health and Wellbeing section. It was those wonderful men and women who work in the Health and Wellbeing team here in the House of Commons who helped me so much to have the confidence and the courage to go back to Shrewsbury to announce to my local association that I was now in a same-sex partnership. And I have to say to you that although they coaxed me into it, when I was on the train going from Shrewsbury to London, I prayed on, I think, 3 separate occasions that the train would break down. I still couldn't quite face it. I hoped that there would be some sort of godly intervention, that something would happen, that the tree would fall on the track or the train would be delayed or something. I would miss my connection and I wouldn't have to deal with it. But the train, of course, arrived on time, unusually, I have to say, at Shrewsbury train station, and I went to see my local association. So I said to them, I gave them my monthly report, the 50 most senior members of Shrewsbury Conservative Association in a room in front of me, and I went through my monthly report about what's happening here in the House of Commons, politics, some of the achievements that we've secured in terms of investment for Shrewsbury over the last quarter. And then I said to them, I looked at them, and I looked at the 50 faces in front of me. And they are marvellous men and women, as I'm sure everybody will agree. Party members from all political parties, Conservatives and Labour. They are the hard workers who go out there in the rain, delivering leaflets, taking abuse on the doorsteps, organising campaigns, and they do it for free. We get paid. But these are men and women who I would always say are the salt of the earth, who believe in their nation, who believe in whatever politics they are affiliated to, whether it's the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, and they are, as you will know, Sir Roger, a Member of Parliament really relies upon those people in the Executive Council and the senior members of the association. We could not do the job that we do if it wasn't for these people. And when I announced to them that I was now in a same-sex partnership, I looked at the 50 faces. And a gentleman in the front row, a traditional Conservative Party member with the striped jacket, a sort of brigadier general type figure, immediately stood up, straight like a military man, stood up and said, "Well, I think that's marvellous. I think that's marvellous. Well done." And started to clap. And then, as if a sea of people in front of me stood up, all of them stood up and started to clap. And coming up to me, giving me hugs. We were in the bar area and they were wanting to buy me whiskey. I went away, rather with a double whiskey, I went away with a tumbler of whiskey because all the men were trying to buy me double scotches. And it was something which will stay with me forever, Sir Roger. It is those moments in life when you throw yourself in a way which you don't know what's going to happen and you don't know how people are going to react. It's those moments in your life that you really see raw humanity in operation. And the love, the kindness, the sincerity that my Shrewsbury Conservative Association treated me is something that will stay with me forever, but it will also empower me for the rest of my life. And I want to end on this point by referencing a lovely gentleman called Ray Mitchell, the late Ray Mitchell, who has now passed away. Ray Mitchell was the gentleman from Shrewsbury Conservatives who ran election campaigns as if it was the Battle of Tobruk, with hardcore military precision. He knew where every single road is. He had people who, with the correct number of bundled leaflets for every person in every street, and he ran a military operation to get my campaign literature across the whole of the constituency every time a general election was called. And he came up to me at the end of my speech when everybody was hugging and cheering, and he said, "I'd like a word with you alone outside, please." And I thought, oh no, here we go. There's somebody who's really upset with what I said, and now I'm going to get it with both barrels. He said, "I'd just come outside for a minute. There's one private word with you." And he said, "I hear," and you will know, Sir Roger, that an association is cut up into different wards, and they all represent different wards. He said, "I hear that you've given one of the other wards a bottle of House of Commons Scotch by the Prime Minister. Can we have one?" He said, "I couldn't give a monkey's about your sexuality. I'm upset that you've given them a bottle of House of Commons Scotch, but you haven't got one for us. Would you mind terribly getting us one?" And I just wanted to share that story with you because it meant so much to me at the time. I've also been, Sir Roger, I think it was last year, to number 10 Downing Street, where there was an LGBT film being premiered in number 10 Downing Street, marking, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the rescinding of jail sentences against LGBT people. And of course, in the audience there in number 10 Downing Street were many senior citizens who had faced prison sentences in the 50s and whose friends had been incarcerated, and they themselves had to, the whole of their lives, live in fear and worry about being exposed for being gay and ultimately being sent to prison. So that was a very important event in my life as well, seeing those people at the LGBT film. So, Roger, I'd like to pay tribute to Mr. Geoffrey Hardy, who has campaigned for LGBT issues in Shrewsbury for many, many decades. And in 2005, thanks to the Labour administration, he was able to undertake a civil partnership. He and his partner, Peter, they had been together for 25 years. They were the first couple in Shropshire to have a civil partnership. And he writes to me to say that Radio Shropshire broadcast the cheer from the registry office, and the Shropshire Star put it on the front page. The reaction we had when driving through Shrewsbury, pink ribbons on the front of a vintage Bentley was overwhelmingly positive. An emotional time for us. Civil partnerships were a huge step change in acceptance of our lives and relationships. And I want to pay tribute to the Labour government for introducing civil partnerships and reiterate the sentence that he says. Civil partnerships were a huge step change in acceptance of our lives and our relationships. Of course, the subsequent Conservative government introduced equal marriage as well, and I will come on to that later. Mr. Hardy has been at the forefront of creating Shropshire Rainbow Film Festival from 2006. And this Rainbow Film Festival has gone from strength to strength. In 2011, we advertised, and this is important, we advertised with, and he's written this in bold, we advertised with banners across the streets, a huge step forward. Year upon year, the festival has become very successful, and more heterosexual people have attended, realizing that our lives and experiences are not separate. But he's put banners across the streets in bold and underlined. This is all about being proud that you're gay, being proud that you are having a film festival promoting LGBT rights and LGBT experiences. And this isn't in metropolitan London. This is in quiet, sleepy Shrewsbury. And the huge enthusiasm for LGBT rights in Shrewsbury is something that comes to the fore from everything that Mr. Hardy has been telling me over the years. He is a staunch socialist and a strong Jeremy Corbyn supporter. So you can imagine how he and I have very little in common when it comes to politics. But we are kindred spirits when it comes to promoting LGBT rights and sharing our experiences. He then goes on to talk about the campaign for equal marriage. And the Roman Catholic bishop was often on the front page of the Shropshire Star in opposition. He says, we distributed flyers, wristbands, and encouraged people to write to their local members of Parliament. And that is a very important issue I wanted to highlight again, Sir Roger. I remember the debate that we had on equal marriage. This was a very difficult issue for me. I had not at that stage come out, and there were many constituents who were writing to me, very angry, very furious, that we could even be contemplating equal marriage. Civil same-sex partnerships was one thing. Civil partnerships was another. But you will, honourable members will remember the anger and antagonism and frustration that there was for equal marriage. This is a step too far. Marriage is only between men and women. And this we should not be pursuing. And of course it was difficult for me at that time, but I voted for equal marriage, and I'm very proud to have done so. And I'm even more proud that it was a Conservative government that put it on the statute book. And again, Sir Roger, there was one couple, very religious couple from the village of Condover, who came to see me. I won't mention their names, but they spent the day with me on the day that we were passing the Equal Marriages Act. And they came and had lunch with me in the House of Commons, the couple with their 2 children, their son, who had been to Shrewsbury School and was now a doctor in Manchester. And the mother turned around to me and said something which will stay with me forever. She said, you have to vote for equal marriage. And she was a very strong Protestant. You have to vote for equal marriage because I don't want my son living in sin. And just remember that for a moment from a devout Protestant lady. You must vote for equal marriage because I don't want my son living in sin. That will stay with me forever. And lastly, from Mr. Hardy, Shrewsbury Carnival Pride. And LGBT Shrewsbury have joined with the Shrewsbury Town Carnival. We have a wonderful town carnival that goes through the whole of Shrewsbury and the quarry every year, and we have massive floats. We're not quite Rio de Janeiro in Shrewsbury, but we do our best. and we have all these floats going through the town, and we've now had, for many years, an LGBT float which passes through the town. And I stood there one year with my partner of 8 years, and we just stood there watching. And to see the applause and the cheering from all young people in Shrewsbury for the LGBT float was something very powerful for me, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And of course, the LGBT float has received many prizes over the years. So, Roger, getting back to specifically the schools element on this, I wanted to read out to you something that Stonewall has sent to me. And it's a quote from Joshua, 19, from Scotland. He says, "I think there needs to be a fundamental rethink about how we teach young people about sex, love, and relationships. LGBT issues need to be an important part of our curriculum in order for us to truly feel we are part of an equal society." And a growing number, another quote which struck me in a lot of evidence that Stonewall have sent me is this, and I'd like honourable members to really listen to this quote and remember it. "A growing number of faith schools, not ordinary schools, but a growing number of faith schools are delivering LGBT inclusive training. They are doing this not in spite of their faith ethos, but because of it. By recognizing the values of love, tolerance, and acceptance that lie at the heart of their faith." And this is such an important quote, because religion has been used so many times, as the Minister will know, in trying to, as I've said from my own experiences of Roman Catholicism, but it also applies to certain Muslim groups and others, that this intolerance towards homosexuality actually goes, I would argue, squarely against the teachings of these religions, especially my religion of Catholicism, which does seek to promote love, tolerance, and acceptance. And that is very, very important to remember. The House of Commons, ahead of this debate, decided to post on Facebook to ask people's views and experiences of teaching on LGBT community and acceptance in schools. And there are two quotes which I think are relevant, which I wanted to share. One of them, Sir Roger, is from Lacuna magazine. Somebody at Lacuna magazine, which is a magazine that promotes human rights. And this person writes, "When I think of how the knot in my teenage heart could have been loosened if I had even one lesson at school telling me I wasn't broken or put together wrong, I realize that this isn't a religious or even spiritual debate, it's a matter of human rights." And that's from Lacuna magazine. And also from the National Secular Society, "We agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Kawczynski that it is important to make sure all children from an early age are taught that there is nothing wrong with being gay. We also agree that doing so would help to improve mental health and reduce bullying and abuse. We fully support efforts to make education in the United Kingdom inclusive for all. We urge the government to ensure every child, regardless of their religious background, leaves school in the knowledge that LGBT+ people are equal and that it's perfectly okay to be gay." I'm going to wrap up shortly, Sir Roger, but I wanted to ask the Minister about the LGBT Action Plan, which the government has put into place. And of course, this has not received sufficient attention because of the merry-go-round that is Brexit and the focus on that issue. But I would like to ask the Minister about one thing which particularly appalls me, which is conversion therapy. I think of conversion therapy as some sort of Frankenstein's monster of abuse, not only physical abuse, but also mental torture. I couldn't imagine possibly anybody wanting to send their child to have some sort of conversion therapy. I think, as I've said to you, Sir Roger, it's impossible to recalibrate the mind. It's impossible to trick the mind. It's impossible to turn somebody from being gay into straight. And I think the mental angst and the mental torture that children would go through on a conversion therapy is something which deeply troubles me. I would like to call the Minister to explain to us when this practice is going to be outlawed in the United Kingdom, and for him to give me an update on that issue. Sir Roger, I, on the one hand, respect the rights of these parents outside these schools in Birmingham to demonstrate. Nobody wants our children to have overtly sexual things in schools at an inappropriately young age. This is a very delicate matter, and it has to be treated with a huge amount of sensitivity. But I appeal to those protesters. What sort of a message does it send out to young LGBT people when we see the anger and the rage and the vitriol emanating from them about LGBT issues? By all means, if they have concerns about LGBT acceptance and education in schools, they ought to be coming to see the Minister, they ought to be lobbying government, they ought to be questioning and probing all the time about how this is going to be implemented, what the sensitivities are. But I appeal to them, show some tolerance and some civility to how vulnerable young people are at that stage, and don't do anything which puts young people thinking that they are not worth and they are somehow unequal. I went through that as a young person. I don't want young people to go through that again. And just before I take an intervention from the Right Honourable Lady, who is somebody I respect enormously from the Labour bench, that's probably done her career no good whatsoever, but she is. I'd like to say that, no, I'll take the intervention first.
I find it difficult to know when to intervene in the honourable member's speech because it has been so powerful, so heartfelt. I have no words except to say how much I applaud absolutely everything he said, and for him to know that I think that his words here today will mean the knot in many teenage hearts will have been loosened. So I feel so proud that he is a member of our House and that he has used his own personal experience as well as his analysis to make the speech he has. And I think this has been very important, and I thank him for doing that.
Well, I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Lady, and I'd like to pay tribute to her. She has been a stalwart of campaigning for equality on LGBT issues, not just today, when it's easier so to do, but she was at the forefront of campaigning on LGBT issues back in the 80s, 70s and 80s and 90s when it wasn't as easy to do that. She herself is not part of the LGBT community, and so her empathy with this issue just shows how pioneering and visionary she is, and the integrity and honour that she has always displayed as a member of this House of Commons. Sir Roger, I will end by saying this. There was recently going to be a footballer, a famous footballer, who plays, I'm not really a football fan, I'm afraid, so I don't follow football, but a very famous footballer was apparently going to come out, and he decided not to do so. And this was all over the radio recently, that he was going to announce that he was out and start raising issues of LGBT, and then he decided to back off. I would say to him publicly on television, and to anybody who is in a position of responsibility or who has a public profile, whether you are a footballer whether you play for England's rugby team, whether you are a television presenter, or whether you are a member of parliament. If you are gay, and if you have come out, it is extremely important to do what I'm doing today, which is to carry on talking and giving assurance to young people that actually, if you go through this process, 99 people out of 100 will show you love, tolerance, and understanding. I took my beloved mother on holiday to our favourite Polish seaside resort this summer with my partner, Fernando. And I'd also like to inform members that after 8 years of being together, we're going to have a civil partnership in the House of Commons on November the 9th. That's if we don't have a... and I tell you this, even if we have an election, it's a Saturday, and I'm going to abandon campaigning to come back to have my civil partnership, because I'm not going to leave my hubby at the altar just because of the general election. I can tell you that for nothing. But we have a duty and a responsibility, Sir Roger, to do this, to give them the confidence, to show them the extraordinary positive experiences that we have had from our fellow men and women in society about how loving and tolerant they are to us. But I took my mother on holiday, and she gave me one example of prejudice. My mother always comes to Shrewsbury every election time. She lives in Gloucestershire, but she comes. Nobody works harder than my mum when it comes to handing out leaflets on doorsteps and canvassing. And she told me of a story. I was talking to her about this debate that I was going to have, and she told me of a story where two men in, I won't mention where it was in Shrewsbury, but two men looked at her in horror when she told them that she was campaigning for Daniel Kawczynski and she was his mum. And they looked at her with disgust and said to her, "Of course we're not going to vote for this deviant." And it's a shame, isn't it? But you can never reason with prejudice. And there are always going to be prejudiced people in our society. And she was upset, of course, that they would say that to her. I would hope that they would assess me and any other gay member of Parliament about our politics and what party we stand for, rather than who we love and who we want to be with. And I remember 1979 watching Margaret Thatcher when she was asked on television, "How could you be a Prime Minister when you're a woman?" And in 1979, there were many people who were really fearful and questioning about the ability of a woman to become Prime Minister. And I'll never forget what Margaret Thatcher said on television. She said, "Well, I say to these people, it's as well you didn't live in the period of Elizabeth I, isn't it? And what would have happened to our great nation if it wasn't for great women like Elizabeth I and what they did for our country?" So Margaret Thatcher fought against prejudice when it came to women standing in politics and achieving the highest role in office. And today, in our own different way, we are standing against prejudice, which still exists in our country. This is I've been to over 90 countries in the world on business and politics, and I would argue that this is one of, if not the, most tolerant and welcoming of societies that I've ever come across in any country in the world. Sometimes I think because we're British, we tend to hide our light under a bushel. I think we ought to be extraordinarily proud, despite our huge political differences over Brexit and other issues. We ought to be proud what a beacon of tolerance this country is compared to other countries around the world, 16 of which I still believe have the death penalty if you happen to love somebody who's of the same sex as you. And we need to always, Sir Roger, promote and celebrate that tolerance, not only in our own country, but as a beacon for other countries around the world that are still on the path towards where we are today. Thank you, Sir Roger.
The question is that this House has considered teaching on LGBT community and acceptance in schools. Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Sir Roger. As ever, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I particularly want to thank the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Aitcham for bringing this debate. I think your reflections, your personal reflections, just bring so much to this debate. And it is genuinely inspiring because I know that other young LGBT children and adults will be listening to this. And to see that someone is able in this place to speak out and be proud to speak out is so inspiring. But I want to start with reflecting on your opening about young people internalising the perceived shame of being gay, and also your closing remarks about the intolerance in society and how that impacts on young LGBT children's lives. Because for me, relationship education is about keeping all children safe. And we have to be aware that 4 in 5 young trans and 3 in 5 young LGBT children self-harm, and that 2 in 5 trans and 1 in 5 LGBT children can contemplate taking their own lives because of the pressure that is put upon them by an intolerant society. And for me, that is why, along with colleagues and charities, I campaigned so hard to get relationship education, particularly at primary school age. I firmly believe that the introduction will have a transforming effect on the next generation, supporting them to form healthy relationships, tolerance, recognise harms and have safe sex. We know that the LGBT young people are often more vulnerable, face greater risks and have lower levels of well-being than their peers. Robust, age-appropriate RSE that is inclusive of LGBT young people and integrates them fully into the curriculum really can help reduce these risks. Research has shown that LGBT young people are more likely to engage in risk-taking behaviour, including unprotected sex. Sex education at secondary school will give pupils information about safe sex and sexually transmitted infections, including HIV and AIDS. Young people need to be aware of these facts. They need to appreciate the importance of condoms and know how to use them properly. They need to be aware of PrEP, PREM, and anti-HIV medications, and where they can find out more information on this. LGBT young people are also at risk online, being more likely than non-LGBT peers to experience online victimisation and have online sexual conversations with people 5 years older or more. Studies have shown that gay and bisexual boys are particularly vulnerable to exploitation by those of the same sex. RSE will support young people to recognise the dangers of grooming and educate young people to spot dangers online. RSE can support all young people to make sensible decisions about meeting up with strangers, using relationship apps intended for adults like Tinder or Grindr, and, very importantly, about consent, particularly informed consent. RSE is not a silver bullet, but my hope is that it will help address some of the wider issues LGBT young people face too, such as mental health issues and bullying. The evidence tells us that adolescence is the most difficult period for people who identify as lesbian, gay or bisexual. While attitudes have improved in the UK, it is still very difficult for young people to come out and access information from support services. LGBT pupils and their families will see their existence validated by RSE lessons. Young people will see LGBT people represented alongside non-LGBT people in educational materials. They'll hear that in modern Britain, our families come in all shapes and sizes, single parents, adoptive parents, same-sex parents. They'll learn alongside their peers of the joys of relationships, as well as how to avoid the harms. And slowly, surely, we may begin to see some of the difference in outcomes that I have mentioned shrink, and hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, disappear entirely. I ask the Minister to ensure teachers have the training and resources they need to deliver high-quality LGBT inclusive education. And I urge the Government to hold firm and continue to publicly encourage primary schools to deliver LGBT inclusive education. I'd like to mention a little bit about some of the myths and excitement that is brewing around relationship education in primary schools. And the main message that is coming across that is against children in primary schools being taught relationship education is it's up to the parent to teach that. It is the parent's choice to teach that. Well, of course it is. And we're looking at, every evening, every weekend, the parent can do that teaching. However, I campaigned for relationship education because I want to prevent harm to children. And we must acknowledge that 90% of child abuse happens within the extended family. So with the best will in the world, if a child has an abusive parent or close family member, how exactly are they meant to know that what's happening to them is wrong unless they get that one lesson where a teacher explains to them what abuse is and how to report it? That doesn't undermine the parents teaching whatever they want to teach in the other hours of the day, but that one lesson could save a child from harm and the lifelong impact that will happen to that child if it endures abuse. Relationship and sex and relationship education is about safeguarding and preventing abuse. Can I congratulate the Minister for all of his work? I know he worked extensively to listen to all parties, all sides of the debate, and I feel that he has come up with a solution that is genuinely focused around preventing harm for the child, but more importantly, creating a more tolerant and accepting society, which is surely something we all want.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Roger. May I first of all join honourable members in congratulating my honourable friend in initiating this debate and for the very moving and inspiring speech which he gave, an explanation about the importance of this subject. And I'm very pleased to be able to take part in it, both as an ordinary member of this House and as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global LGBT Rights, which is one of the largest APPGs in this Parliament. Much of our work is focused on the need to ensure that terrible abuses of LGBT plus people around the world don't happen, and in pressing for action to deal with it. But in doing that, we have to ensure that we are upholding the highest standards in our own country. And I think after the conclusion of equal marriage legislation in England and Wales, which was followed rapidly by Scotland, it was easy to think that the legislative journey was largely complete in most of the United Kingdom, and that we could lift our sights and look at what was happening globally. But of course, there is unfinished business in our own country. There is the unfinished business of equal marriage in Northern Ireland, for a start. But there are also continuing concerns about the bullying of young people. There are continuing concerns about discrimination in the workplace. There are particular concerns about the lack of role models in certain sports and the need to ensure that young people and the heroes that they have fully reflect the diversity of today's society. So there is much work that still needs to be done, and that is, I think, particularly true in schools, because we know from Stonewall's school survey that was done that there has been an absence of the kind of sex and relationship education that children need to ensure that they can be safe, that they understand the importance of all of that, that they understand that relationships can be different but are just as valid, that if they themselves are different, that is nothing to worry about. All of that is immensely important, and that's why I really welcome the guidance which the government issued this year, which was intended to strengthen sex and relation education guidance in secondary schools and relationships education in primary schools. But there are a number of issues that I think we just need to consider. The first has been brought into sharp relief by the protests outside Birmingham schools. I attended a meeting that was, I think, of representatives of Parkfield School in Birmingham that was organised in this House a month or two ago. And frankly, I had already been pretty horrified by the film that we were all watching on the news of the protests and the nature of those protests that was taking place outside those schools. I was even more alarmed when I listened to the evidence of the leaders of those schools and the pressures that they felt that they had been put under by those parents. And they did raise one issue that I simply want to put to the Minister, and I do this in as neutral a way as I can, but I just want to understand what the government's view of this is, because while relationships education has effectively been made discretionary for primary schools, the views of these head teachers was that it should not be. They felt that the fact that it was discretionary placed a huge burden and responsibility on them and made them the targets of parental protest, and that it would actually be easier for them if it was very clear to every school what was required of them to teach. Now, I think there may be good reasons why it has been framed in this way by the government, so I'm not offering a criticism of the government, but I would like to understand what the rationale is and to question whether, at the very least, the guidance that is being offered to schools needs to be more explicit, or whether more effort needs to be made to ensure that this guidance can be implemented by schools without them fearing any kind of repercussion. The second issue that I want to raise is the whole question of protests outside of schools. My honourable friend said so much that I agreed with, but one thing I did not agree with him about was when he said that he respected the right to demonstrate outside schools. I would like to raise the question about whether it is ever right to have protests, particularly of the kind that we have seen, outside school gates. And I note that my right honourable friend, the new Secretary of State, said that he thought that there was no place for protests outside any schools. And I think that I agree with that, particularly outside primary schools. When these protests are vociferous, bullying, must be intimidating to parents. And if they are intimidating to parents, what can their children be thinking about this? And these are young children too. And I think most of us who saw the film, the way in which these parents were conducting themselves outside the schools, the manner in which they were hectoring, was actually disturbing. And I think that we are, of course, all proud of living in a country where peaceful protest is permitted. It is part of the sort of fundamental nature of our democracy that we allow that. But we've always understood, haven't we, that where protest spills over into harassment, it is not acceptable. It indeed becomes criminal. And good policing relies on the ability to exercise a judgment about where that line has been crossed. And I think there is a real question about whether these kinds of protests should be allowed right outside the school gate, because they are harassing, and I think it's important that that issue is looked at as well. The third issue I just want to raise is the question of resources, because the new guidance is, as I said, immensely welcome. But there is a question that has been raised by Stonewall, which does such excellent work in this area, and others, about whether there is sufficient resource to ensure that schools can receive the training and information that they need to implement the new guidance. I think the estimate of the amount of money that would be needed, that the government made itself, was a sum that was considerably in excess of the £6 million that has been available. Now, today, the Chancellor has made an immensely welcome announcement of a spending uplift for our schools. And I wonder if my right honourable friend will be able to say whether he thinks more resource will be available to schools to ensure that this important new guidance can be implemented in an effective way. I was very heartened by the statement of the new Education Secretary when he said that head teachers should be able to teach about Britain as it is today. I think that our head teachers, our school governors, our chairs of governors and teachers need to know that the strongest possible lead is being given by ministers and this place about the importance of same-sex relationship education. And I question the extent to which we should at all license any suggestion that it is right to prevent teaching that same-sex relationships are valid. We have, I think, got past the point where we believe it's acceptable to sell goods on a discriminatory basis. We've outlawed that. Where you can discriminate against people in the workplace, we've outlawed that. In so many areas of public life now, we are absolutely clear that discrimination on the grounds of sexuality is simply unacceptable. So I question why it might be acceptable to prevent a school from teaching, even if it's children who are of a relatively young age, that same-sex relationships are valid. And I'm not sure that we should be tolerant about those who are seeking to try and prevent that if we are going to uphold the values that we hold dear in this country. And to allow the importance of that kind of teaching to be swept aside seems to me to be potentially subjecting young children to understanding the wrong thing at a very formative age. So I think we should be resolute about universal values of equality and resolute right from the top and transmit those values to every school. And I'm afraid that I think that if there are those who are saying that they don't wish this validity to be taught, I think we have to face that down, just as we do if we say that if people say that they would like to be able to exclude gay couples from their bed and breakfast, or they would like to be able not to employ a gay person, or they would like not to be able to offer a service to gay couples. We don't tolerate that anymore. Why should we tolerate this? I think that we have to be clear about that, precisely because this is such an important age that children should be taught about our common values. May I say this finally? My honourable friend mentioned the issue of the Catholic Church. A few months ago, my honourable friend, the member for Reigate, who is the secretary of the all-party parliamentary group on global LGBT rights that I mentioned, and I attended a meeting in the Vatican, which was intended to be with the Pope, but transpired in the end to be with the Cardinal Secretary of State, to discuss with Baroness Helena Kennedy and the International Bar Council and others the Catholic Church's stance on homosexuality. And the particular proposal that we were making is that the Catholic Church could and should at the very least condemn violence against LGBT people. Catholic Church has immense influence and importance in many regions of the world, particularly in South America and Southern Africa. And it is a shame that there is not a stronger stance on the part of leaders of the Catholic Church against something that we should all be able to agree with, whatever our view about homosexuality and the validity of homosexual relationships. That violence against anybody is wrong. And I think the Catholic Church should be able to say that, and I think it would be immensely powerful if they could. In my work as chair of the new Global Equality Caucus, tying up parliamentarians from across the world to promote LGBT+ rights, I go to many different countries to talk to parliamentarians about these issues. Next week, I will be talking to Czech parliamentarians about same-sex marriage. The following week, I will be in Tokyo talking to Japanese politicians and others from the Asia-Pacific region about equality issues. We have to be able to hold our heads up high in doing that, and I think for the most part we can. But this is unfinished business in our schools. I'm grateful for the robust stance that the government has taken, but it really must see this through now. with the clearest possible guidance, with the clearest possible leadership and support for those teachers that are being oppressed in Birmingham and elsewhere, and with the resources to match.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Before I start my remarks, I just want to pay tribute to the honourable gentleman opposite from Shrewsbury, who spoke with such passion and honesty and authenticity in his remarks. Many times in these debates, we talk about what happens to LGBT young people and the coming out stories of young people. And actually, one of the areas that we sometimes neglect is people who come out perhaps a little bit later in life, and the difficulties that are built around norms that have been built around them, that, especially if they're coming from a more overtly heterosexual relationship, into being able to discover who they are and be honest about it. It's harder, and the courage that he spoke about today is to his credit, and I thank him for tabling this debate. I also want to just say that I'm very pleased to see the Minister still in his place after the reshuffle. And so he and I have spent many time talking about schools in Plymouth, and some of those experiences I'll try and reference here today. It is right that every child in our schools should know about the world. It's right they should know about what are the difficulties around the world. They should know about what are the amazing bits about our world. They should be taught about about families, about their communities, about what is right and what is wrong. Now, that is not exclusively the role of teachers and teaching assistants. Parents, communities, grandparents, friends have a role as well. But we must make sure that every single child knows that they have worth, that they are loved, and that they have rights. They have the right not to be abused. They have the right to make a decision about what happens to their own bodies. And that is a type of education that can only be provided on a universal basis if it is provided universally to all our children. And that's why teaching SRE in schools is so important. That must be universal. Now, the Minister and I have spoken about this a few times, and one of the things I'll be grateful if he could come to just in his remarks is how are we to do this for those children who are homeschooled? Because in Plymouth, we're seeing a great rise in children who are homeschooled, sometimes because they're being excluded from schools, and I'm concerned about the increase in exclusions in government policy, about what that will mean to those kids, especially with SEND and mental health problems, who are unable to cope and get the support they need in their mainstream education, and then are taught outside those environments. And how are we making sure that all the homeschooled kids are getting the understanding that kids in more traditional education settings are getting? I think it is right that we say that there is nothing wrong with being LGBT. And the honourable gentleman opposite from Arundel and South Down said we should not tolerate anyone that discriminates. And that's right. But actually the key to not tolerating things is recognition that the hate has not gone away. And this is really important because I think sometimes there has been this understanding that now we have legislative barriers about preventing discrimination, that we have somehow crossed the Rubicon, that suddenly we're in this age of equality where there is no discrimination. And actually what it has done is taken some of that hostility to equality, that uncomfortableness with it, sometimes from based on traditional values, sometimes based on religious views, sometimes based on misapprehensions or misunderstandings. That hasn't gone away. People have just felt unable to voice it. Now, that is the type of anger that we saw sometimes articulated with the Brexit debate, that people had views that they didn't feel they could express. The key to dealing with discrimination in these things here is not just calling out hate and bigotry, although we must do that. It's education. It's helping people understand about what their neighbours are like, why it matters that we celebrate our diversity in all our communication. That is why education is absolutely key in this regard. And that's why the debate around SRE in schools has been so powerful. Because instead of it being a debate around negatives, it has been a debate around positives. It's about, look what can be achieved if we show every single child that they have a value, they have a worth, and that their diversity matters. It is something that is really positive, and fantastic spokespeople. The honourable gentleman opposite mentioned Stonewall, who have been fantastic advocates here, but they are not the only ones. There are many more besides. I want to pay tribute in particular to one of my heroes who I met recently, Ollie Pike, the LGBT author. Writing LGBT children books can have such a profound effect on young people. I gave my young nephew Tango Makes Three, which is the book that I've spoken about in the main chamber around a pair of gay penguins that adopt a baby penguin. And it is a wonderful, beautiful story. And it fits so well on his little bookshelf. And the thing that makes it so perfect is that he knows no difference. between those two penguins being two boy penguins and penguins being a man and a woman, because it is just normal, because we teach in discrimination to our children, and if we don't teach it in, they don't have it in the same respects. And that is something that I'm very proud of. And people like Ollie Pike, who have written books, other authors like the ones that have written Tangos Make Three, make such a big contribution here. And when we're talking about LGBT education, it's important that we just don't say the word LGBT as if it is one word, and it covers just one type of person. As someone who is very proud to be gay, I fit in the G bit. Now, the G bit dominates much of the debate, frequently because lots of the G bit is white men. Yeah. And white men tend to dominate lots of debates. They just do. It is just part of the debate, which frequently means that the voices of the Ls, the lesbian communities, frequently gets drowned out, that actually there doesn't have that self-worth. And that certainly, and this is discrimination even within the gay community, if you are a B, if you're bisexual, that is still not a validity towards bisexuality. There is still a concern about it, or they haven't made their mind up yet. We've heard it time and time before. We hear it in our LGBT culture, and actually that reduces the validity of people who are bisexual. And then we have trans people, and especially for trans young people. That is where we have huge unfinished business, to borrow the phrase from the Honourable Gentleman opposite, that we need to deal with. Because as the stats from my friend from Rotherham mentioned, there are far too many of our young trans kids who are harming themselves. 27% of our trans kids have attempted suicide, according to some figures from Stonewall. 9 in 10 have thought about it. 72% have attempted self-harm. 4 in 5 trans kids say they've been verbally abused because of who they are. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough. And as a culture, as a society, as a country, we must set an objective that we are to eliminate that type of abuse. And we can only do that if we put that effort into education. Education of not only the children, but as a society as a whole. And it is amazing how powerful teachers children can be. Teaching friends and family about what they learnt in school that day. Teaching others that that's not right to do. And actually, one of those bits that makes that sometimes so powerful is at Pride events. And this year, sadly, due to high winds, Plymouth Pride was called off because of the 60-mile-an-hour gusts that would have taken the rather fabulous stage and lifted it into the crowd, which is probably a good reason that the organisers cancelled it. But that passion that comes from it has only focused their dedication to make Plymouth Pride 2020 even bigger and hopefully involving more of our armed forces, because next year is the 20th anniversary of members of the armed forces being able to openly serve as being LGBT. And that is something that we should celebrate. And I hope that the government and through the minister, through the MOD ministers, will be able to provide that real steer as a point of celebration. Because everyone who serves in our uniform, we should be proud of, whether they are straight or gay or bisexual or lesbian or trans. And actually at a time when our biggest ally, America, is not pursuing policies towards trans members of their own military, we should be proud in making a distinction that they are welcome and they are valued in our own. But hate is on the rise, and education in our schools is one way of challenging that. And I spoke to some young kids about an incident that happened at Plymouth, at Northampton Town against Plymouth Argyle at the weekend, and it was a concern from a young person about what they had read in the local paper about homophobic abuse being shouted by a member of the Green Army, Plymouth Argyle's travelling fans, at a Northampton Town home fan. They described the initial chant, they read it, it says, "Who is the queer in the pink?" aimed at a fan, and then shouts of faggots. And this young person was really disturbed about that. Really disturbed because they didn't want that hate in their game. And that was really powerful. And in the past, as a gay football supporter myself, I have not always felt that football has done enough to promote that equality. And actually, that is something that hasn't happened here. And for the young people in Plymouth growing up gay, or growing up just recognising that they live in a diverse society, the statement from Plymouth Argyle, I think, is immensely warming. It says, "Plymouth Argyle Football Club is a community-focused, values-driven organisation. It is our legal duty to eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimisation on the basis of age, disability, gender reassignment, pregnancy, maternity, marriage and civil partnership, ethnicity, religion and belief, gender and sexual orientation." Now, how many times have we heard a football club say the values that we all hold dear so clearly? And the club itself should be praised for their quick and speedy response. The Argyle fans trust, and Andy Simons, the chair in particular, in coming out and saying, we will not accept hate in our game. that needs to be kicked out, just as we're attempting to kick out racism. The rainbow laces that the FA and Stonewall have been promoting should be kicking out anti-LGBT discrimination from our game as well. And that matters, because when we spoke earlier, I am a football fan, and for me, growing up, seeing an entire set of straight role models, not a single gay role model in football, is something that actually affects your idea that you're associated. And for our young people growing up at the moment, they need to see role models in all different societies. And actually, someone growing up in the 80s, if you were out in the media, you were a flamboyant queen. And actually, you made your protection against discrimination part of your act. That you were colourful and loud and brash, and that's how you could cope with people calling you queer or faggot. And actually, that's great for a small part of the LGBTQ community. But actually, for the vast majority of us, we need to see a range of role models. A range of role models in different workplaces, different walks of lives. And that is something that can directly contribute to the teaching in our schools, teaching about diversity that we've got, because there is rising hate in society. I had someone, after the Defend Democracy protest, come up to me and ask me why I spoke about there being in our politics not enough diversity, when I said that in politics there are far too many straight, white, round, middle-aged men. And he said, why did you mention the straight bit? And for me, it was a really interesting learning experience. I've reflected on it, because there are a lot of straight, middle, white, round men in politics, both in terms of parliamentary in here, but also in local government, where there certainly is a lot of it. And actually, it's a disquiet and an uncomfortable nature about talking about sexuality that I think we need to address. Because if we are to truly deal with discrimination, we need to empower all our young people to feel they have a value, and we need to empower all the parents and communities to recognise that diversity is a good thing. It is not a threat. It is not a threat. And that is important, because sometimes the debate about teaching SRE in our schools has been flipped from the teacher that you trust to teach your child every single day, to teach maths, to teach history. Well, we don't suddenly think by teaching history the teachers are turning every single child into a murderous dictator from the past or from a bloodthirsty pirate. We teach them that they're learning. And that is what age-appropriate SRE means, because they're being taught something age-appropriate for who they are, so they can value who they are, so they can recognise it in their own friends and family and in who they are. And whether those kids are straight, gay, bi, or trans, it's a message that's important, because there is rising hate in society, and we need to recognise that, and we need to do our best to invest in the education of it. And I'm really glad that the member for Shrewsbury spoke about conversion therapy, because there are figures, prominent political figures, who say words in and around conversion therapy. Science may yet produce an answer to homosexuality at some stage. Conversion therapy is cruel, it's wrong, and it starts from a place that says every individual is not valued for who they are. And that is something that we must not accept in our society. And just as Plymouth Argyle has said, there is no place for bigotry and no place for racism or discrimination or homophobia. And it's not homophobia, people are not scared of gays, they're just bigots. We need to be clear that actually in every walk of life, we need to value every single one we've got. And so I'm grateful for the efforts that the government has listened to the cross-party concerns around our SRE and RSE in schools and done something about it. But the final point I just want to end on is what happens when we don't teach it. And this is important. If you don't get taught about who you are, where are you finding that information out? Because as a young gay man, I wanted to know what these feelings were. I wanted to know what was going on in my head. And just as the honourable gentleman spoke about, I had similar conversations with myself. Perhaps a bit less God on this side, but nonetheless similar conversations. And actually, if you don't get it, when you're talking about healthy relationships, when you're talking about SRE, where do you get your information about safe sex and who you sleep with? Is it from your mates, your parents, from teachers? No, it's from pornography. It's from pornography, and that creates a really skewed impression of what a healthy relationship is. It creates a skewed impression of what your role is in any sexual relationship. And it creates a skewed impression about safe sex, about the propensity of bareback sex or abuse or violence or intimidation, which is not healthy for anyone that we have to do. And there is one thing in particular here that I am concerned about, and that is the rise of our Insta-famous culture that is recognised amongst our young people. People who are famous for nothing else but being quite attractive on Instagram. And actually there is a growth from this, and I've seen it, and I've had parents tell me about this, about the growth of being Insta-famous to then self-publishing pornography. young people feeling that they must post increasing pictures of themselves without their tops on, or with low-cut dresses on, or with perfect abs and six-packs, with provocative images of other parts, and then with platforms like OnlyFans that allows people to self-publish their own pornography. Not being abused by a publishing house elsewhere, but self-publishing their own pornography, that being an avenue for some young people to transition from being Insta-famous to publishing their own pornography. Now, in some cases, those kids are doing when they turn 18, are creating a business model that, being young is attractive, good on them. But in other cases, there is a risk that they are being pushed into doing something that they might not otherwise do. And that is something that we can get out of, we can educate with decent, age-appropriate education in our schools. So like the comrades and colleagues from across the House, I support the call that Stonewall has echoed for greater funding of the teaching and training of our teachers in this space here. But there is a lot that we have achieved, but there's still a lot of unfinished business. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could reflect especially on how we deal with Insta-famous and the self-publishing pornography in his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Gale. As ever, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And just to follow another inspirational speech from my friend from Plymouth, Sutton and Davenport, who spoke with real passion and about that hate is rising in society rather than decreasing. And as a fellow football fan, I seem to be mentioning my football team quite a lot this week in Manchester City. I just want to pay tribute to all they do for the LGBT community in Manchester in getting rid of discrimination on the football terraces and promoting proper integration, but a really, really powerful speech. The Honourable Member, can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Aitcham for securing this important debate and for such powerful testimony. And I'm sure every member here would wish his researcher and his researcher's friend well, and we should all echo the thanks I think he gave to the wellness and health team here in the House who helped him, and I know who help other members through a variety of issues. Just before I get into the bones of the debate, just to say, based on his inspirational speech, I'm going to have to come out here live now as well and also say that I'm a Roman Catholic. Which a gay friend of mine teased me about not so long ago. And honestly, we don't need collars to tell us that you can't partake in liturgy or sacrament or believe in solidarity, subsidiarity, or in the preferential option for the poor or in the universal destinations of goods if you don't believe in the heart of the faith, which is human dignity. And if you don't believe in the heart of the faith, which is that, you should not be able to partake in the rest of it. And I put here a note that we've seen under the new pontiff, I think, much better direction. For he said, who are we to judge? Who are we to judge anybody who is gay? And he went on to say, I'm saying this as convener, just for the record, Mr Gale, as the Catholic Legislators Network here in Westminster, a homosexual man and woman has a right to a family, to a father, to a mother, to a son. Their parents have a right to a son and a daughter, and no son and daughter can cast out because of the sexuality of their child. And I think he was right to say that. And being a Mancunian, I had the great honour of delaying my departure down here a few weeks ago, just before the recess, because the Governor of the Bank of England was launching the new £50 note at the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, which had Alan Turing on it, who was obviously the Professor of Mathematics at Manchester University, and that's why the location was chosen. One of the greatest heroes in this country's history cracked the Enigma code at Bletchley, defeated a Nazi, which led to defeating Nazi tyranny, and ended the war early, estimating saving countless millions of lives. And how did we as a society go on to treat him when he was living in Manchester and elsewhere? Absolutely appallingly. And he mentioned what we did to gay people in the 40s and 50s. And way before that. And I think we were all proud at the time. I wasn't a member of this House, but if I remember rightly, the then Prime Minister Brown offered a posthumous pardon for Alan Turing. So if anybody has a chance to, and a few minutes to spare, read Mark Carney's, the Governor of the Bank of England, speech at the launch of that. It was really powerful, moving testimony. Now, there's a cross-party consensus about the need for inclusive RSE. And this isn't going to do my career any good, but I have to concur with the Honourable Member for Rotherham that I think the Minister's shown some incredible personal leadership and political leadership on this. That's the last time I'm going to say anything like that around the Minister. And I think he probably has felt the love from some of us on these benches, and including the Shadow Secretary of State, my boss, the member for Ashton-under-Lyne, on this. So I've said it now, I'm going to move on. There are going to be some criticisms later in the speech. Now, figures from the school report in 2017 show that 40% of LGBT pupils are never taught anything about the issue at school. We must provide comprehensive support for our teachers. Compulsory SR relationship and sex education was championed by my honourable friend sat behind me, which she got included as an amendment, I think rightly on the Children and Social Work Act in 2017. So I think a huge debt of honour goes to my honourable friend. I would have an issue with the Minister about how we get things on the curriculum in this country, and I'm not sure that's always the best way, but it was through my honourable friend's personal endeavour and tenaciousness, I think, over a long period of time that we're in the place we are today. It was also reflected in the proposals of the then Secretary of State for Education, the Right Honourable Member for Putney, who I thought also did work very well on this. The elements of personal, social, health, education to make it mandatory in schools. High-quality relationship and sex education will help create safe communities. That's essentially what we're saying. Inadequate relationship and sex education leaves pupils vulnerable, and particularly vulnerable to abuse. The one I take up with the member for Shrewsbury about the church and the priests. There was a famous Catholic theologian, Karl Reiner, who said that power was a gift from God. And abuse of minors has got absolutely nothing to do with homosexuality. And some people have said this. It's nothing to do with this. It's an abuse of power. There are two types of power in our land. There's relational power and there's coercive power. And it was all about coercive power. And I think that point needs generously making. Now, the government's draft guidance clearly sets out the rights of parents, carers to withdraw children from sex, but not relationship education. It also notes the role of parents in the development of their children's understanding about relationships. For primary schools, the draft guidance states that head teachers would automatically grant a request to withdraw a pupil from any sex education other than parts of the science curriculum. In secondary schools, parents will still have a right to request withdrawal from some or all sex education delivered as parts of statutory RSE. And this request would be granted in all but exceptional circumstances. And this would apply up to three terms before the child turns 16, at which the child would then not be able to opt in to sex education if they so choose. But as somebody who was I'll take the intervention.
It might seem like a small point, but I never got clarification on it. Sorry, I was confused by the Minister. Will the parents be told if the child decides to have the education in those last terms?
Yeah, I'll leave that to the Minister.
The was an indication that we are running out of time.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Do you want me to? So, I mean, a key, as somebody who taught relationship and sex education in a primary school at year 5 for many years, we had really stringent policies, and also that would put us automatically on our safeguarding alerts about people who were withdrawing. And I think we need to think about that really, really seriously. Now, there's a danger that without a clear steer from the government, there are big variations between schools. What we need is resources going into those schools. This new framework has to be adequately funded, and that's where we'll hold the Minister's feet to the fire. Now that he's survived another regime change, and he's one of the longest service ministers ever. I made a Bee Gees joke yesterday. I won't repeat it today. Now, children must know their rights if they are to exercise them throughout their life. Relationship and sex education is effective when it sits as part of a whole school approach embedded across the curriculum with well-trained staff. The government must now ensure schools have the resources to deliver this.
Thank you very much, Roger. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I first of all start by welcoming and congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, for a very passionate and moving speech. And we're all very grateful to him for organising this debate, for securing this debate, and for the way he introduced this debate today. And also for very moving speeches and powerful speeches from the Honourable Member for Rotherham, the Right Honourable Member for Arundel and South Downs, and the Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport. Now, my honourable friend, the Member for Shrewsbury, said that he was the first Conservative MP, the only Conservative MP to have been born in a communist country, namely Poland, in 1972. Well, let's hope, Sir Roger, that the forthcoming general election doesn't lead to a Corbyn-led Labour government, lest in 20 years' time we have many more MPs who have been born in a communist country. Now, my honourable friend asked about conversion therapy. Well, he is right to point out that in the government's 2018 LGBT Action Plan, we committed to bringing forward proposals to end the unacceptable and abusive practice of conversion therapy in the UK. We are currently engaging with stakeholders and we'll set out further steps in due course, but he can be rest assured that we take this issue very seriously and will be taking action. Now, Sir Roger, schools play a critical role in promoting integration and widening opportunities for all communities, including LGBT young people. Many schools already do this successfully, creating inclusive environments where children are able to learn the values that underpin our society. Through education, we can ensure that the next generation learns about those values of fairness, tolerance and respect. And the government is clear that every pupil, regardless of their sexuality, deserves the opportunity to progress and fulfil their potential, and to do so in an environment that is free from prejudice and discrimination. And I am personally committed and determined, for example, to stop the use of the word gay as a pejorative term in our schools, as this can often cause anxiety to LGBT pupils, in fact to all pupils. The DfE is providing over £2.8 million of funding between September 16 and March 2020 to 4 anti-bullying organisations to support schools to tackle bullying effectively, and the GEO is also providing £3 million between 2016 and 2019 to help prevent and respond to homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying, and have invested a further £1 million to extend this funding to March next year. Now, respect for all is fundamental to the reforms we have made to the curriculum. We are making relationships and health education compulsory for all primary schools, and relationships, sex and health education compulsory for all secondary schools. And we are encouraging as many schools as possible to start teaching the new subjects from September 2019, when they will be required to do so from September 2020. And I would like to pay tribute to the honourable member, the member for Rotherham, for the huge part she played in campaigning for relationship education and in helping the government develop and then implement its policy so successfully. I do pay tribute to her. Let us remember that these subjects actually address and what they address, Sir Roger, and why their introduction gained the overwhelming support of this House. At the heart of relationships and health education in primary schools is a focus on putting in place the key building blocks of healthy, respectful relationships, focusing on family and friendships in all contexts, including online. And at secondary, teaching will build on the knowledge acquired at primary and develop further pupils' understanding of health, with an increased focus on risk areas such as drugs and alcohol, as well as introducing knowledge about intimate relationships and sex. And these subjects also represent a significant step forward in terms of equality, by ensuring that young LGBT people will receive teaching relevant to their lives and preparing them for the adult world and supporting them to form positive, healthy, nurturing relationships. And as set out in the statutory guidance, we are clear that all pupils should receive teaching on LGBT relationships during their school years. Secondary schools should include LGBT content in their teaching, and primary schools are strongly encouraged and enabled when teaching about different types of families to include families with same-sex parents. And the reality of this will be reflected at the school gates, of course, of many primary schools, with some children being dropped off and picked up by 2 mums or 2 dads. And it's right that pupils understand that these families in which their classmates are growing up are characterised by love and care, just like any other family, and are equally deserving of respect. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for Arundel and South Downs, asks about discretion, the discretion that we have given primary schools about teaching LGBT. And we think it is right for schools to decide their curriculum based on the needs of their particular cohort of pupils. And we have been clear that for the majority of primary schools, teaching about LGBT people and relationships will be age appropriate for their pupils, and we strongly encourage them to do so. But we have been at pains to ensure that this groundbreaking policy carries as much support as possible and achieves a broad consensus. And this has been generally achieved, and we have applied the requirement to teach RSE only to schools in the state sector, not only, to the schools in the state sector. We've applied this requirement to schools in the independent sector as well, including independent Orthodox faith schools. The law applies to those schools as well, and we have managed to achieve consensus with many of the religious organisations, and that's why we've had that discretion in the teaching. Now, the Honourable Member for Rotherham asked about training material to enable teachers to teach RSE, and my right honourable friend, the member for Arundel, raised the same issue. The Department is committed to supporting schools to deliver high-quality teaching of relationships education, and to support schools, we are investing up to £6 million in this financial year for the Department to develop a programme of support for schools. The funding will not be distributed to schools. It's about preparing the materials, and further funding beyond the next financial year, of course, is a matter for the spending review that's just been announced. So the programme of support will focus on tools that improve schools' practice, such as an implementation guide that my right honourable friend has referred to, easy access to high-quality resources, and support for staff training. And the Department is currently working with schools and teachers to develop a programme of support that's suited to their needs. Also, to support this, we're also setting up a new working group, and they'll provide insight to how the guidance is working in practice, and that's chaired by Ian Balcom, CBE, who's our education advisor and senior head teacher. Now, Mr. Sir Roger, we are very clear that parents from all faiths and none do not want their children to feel bullied or excluded at school, or to feel that their family was not equally valued. And through our call for evidence and the consultation on the content for these subjects, there was an absolute consensus that all pupils should be taught, as a minimum, about respect for themselves and for others. And I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his passionate speech, and I hope we can all agree that children are never too young to learn about love, kindness, tolerance, difference, compassion and empathy as part of creating a cohesive school community and in building a tolerant society. We need to do all we can to loosen the knot in the hearts of LGBT young people with relationships lessons and with role models such as some of the honourable members who have spoken in this important today with such eloquence and passion and honesty.
Daniel Kawczynski, to wind up the debate briefly, please.
Very grateful, Sir Roger, and I'd like to thank the honourable members from Rotherham, Plymouth, Sutton and Arundel and South Downs who spoke so eloquently and with such great passion. I must admit my interaction with the honourable member from Plymouth Sutton has been relatively limited since he joined the House. I will certainly look forward to getting to know him better and working together in the coming years on promoting LGBT rights across our country. We didn't have as many members as attending this debate because of the Brexit debate in the main chamber, but I'm sure a lot of young people around the country have been listening to what we have to say today and how we support them being supported over LGBT issues in schools. And finally, Sir Roger, my right honourable friend, the member for Arundel and South Downs, mentioned that he felt that it was the idea of parents protesting outside schools on these sort of issues is something that the government ought to be looking at. I couldn't agree with him more. I was trying to be a little bit more circumspect in my comments, but he has given me the courage and conviction to think about this issue more, and I would strongly reiterate to the Minister the sentiment that has been conveyed. Thank you, Sir Roger.
The question is that this House has considered teaching on LGBT community and acceptance in schools. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order.